Hey, this is Clark with Pass the Baton. And looking at history, there's a man by the name of Confucius who lived about the 5th century BC in China. Very well known, obviously, for his sayings that Confucianism. Buddha also lived in India around the same time, 5th century. But biblically, there was a lady who lived, as well as her family and some other well known people, around the same time. And the book of Esther is written around the same time that Confucius lived. Yet Confucius is never mentioned in the book of Esther, no doubt because he had nothing to do with the redemption of mankind. He had some great sayings, real knowledge there, but Confucius had nothing to do with God using Jesus Christ to redeem the world. And so he's never spoken of. Buddha's never spoken of, even though during the same time this book is written, they are living around that same time. Today in the book of Esther, I want to talk about a story that happens there that I feel like goes along with some thoughts that I've been having, and no doubt other people have been having as well. But in the book of Esther, just to kind of give you a little backdrop, King Xerxes is also, depending on what translation you have, it may have Ahasuerus. Maybe I'm not saying that right. There's 3 or 4 different ways. All you have to do is just Google correct pronunciation of King, put the name in. You'll have a couple different ways of saying it, but Ahasuerus is the king there of Persia, also known as Xerxes, and that's probably what I'll be saying if I mention the name throughout the remainder of the DVD or the recording here that we're doing. But during the time he's king, and he's basically having this party, and he wants to show off his wife, Queen Vashti, and she says no. She understands that she's just going to parade around in front of this group of men and kind of be gawked at or whatever, and she says no. Well, this didn't sit too well with King Xerxes, and so he decides to banish her, get rid of her as queen. And a lot of things happen. A couple years takes place when they're actually gone, and then they decide, I'm going to pick a new queen. Well, they have different ladies brought in, and they're brought in between to those people who would keep the women of the court. They would go through their purification, which literally, according to the book of Esther, was a year-long purification. And then, of course, they would come in to the king. He would decide which one he wanted, and eventually he picked Esther, who was a Jew. Now, Esther had lost her parents. She was an orphan, but she was taken in by her cousin. And sometimes if you just read different sermons or just different commentaries, some people will say that Mordecai was her uncle. And I don't really know why, but some people say that. But literally, as you're reading through, at least in the King James or the ESV, when you're reading through, it says that he took in his uncle's daughter. So this was no doubt his cousin. So he was probably a lot older, but she was an orphan. He took her in. And so here's Esther, who had been taken in by Mordecai. She ends up becoming the queen. Well, during this time, here's Esther. They didn't even realize she was a Jew. King Xerxes didn't know she was Jewish, but she was the queen. Now, this didn't mean it was necessarily a life of luxury for her, although I'm sure she had a lot of things that other people didn't have. It was still a life of solitude in some ways, because she wasn't even allowed to go into the king just whenever she wanted, and she was no doubt with the keepers of the women and the other, some of the concubines. Maybe it's definitely in that year-long time when they were doing their purification, she was just kind of kept sheltered with maybe some of the other women and that sort of thing. But here she is, she's become queen, and this man named Haman is appointed as leadership by King Xerxes. And Haman's going down the street, and Mordecai, who is Esther's cousin, he refuses to bow to Haman. No doubt, Mordecai knew his allegiance was with God, the God of the Hebrews, the one and only God, and he would not bow. So Haman ends up coming up with this idea he's going to destroy all the Jews. Now, obviously this is a big deal, especially if you're Jewish. And Esther, they didn't even realize she was a Jew. But here's Mordecai. He's out. He clothes himself in sackcloth and ashes. He's outside the gate because they were not allowed inside the gate with the sackcloth and ashes. He's outside the gate. Some of Esther's maids, as well as the keepers of the women, they had saw what was going on. They let Esther know. Esther sends word back. She sends word back to Mordecai and says, what's up? And he lets her know, all the Jewish people are basically, we're under an edict that they're all going to be killed. There's not going to be any left. They're just going to get rid of them. Haman and Xerxes, they've decided on this. This is what's happened. And so Esther's just like, no doubt she's thinking it through. And you can read all this in the book of Esther, chapter 1 through 4. And as you get into the chapter 4, and I'm going to read this. I'll read this from the ESV. It says, and they told Mordecai what Esther had said, and Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself. Now understand that this is an extremely common phrase, and it's a phrase that is to encourage hope and encourage different things in people, but I'm going to try to take this and bring out maybe some things we haven't thought of before, and probably you have, but if not, it says, for if you keep silent this time, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish, and who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Now here's this very well-known phrase, and by the way, in translation, so many translations, you can just look this up, and this phrase, these 6 words, pretty much remain the same in just about every translation, for such a time as this. Some would say for just such a time as this, or for just a time as this. But for the most part, it stays the same, for such a time as this. And what a well-known phrase. So many people have heard this, whether you've been in church, whether you haven't. A lot of people maybe even heard of Queen Esther because of different movies or plays or whatever that's taken place. So we see the backdrop of this story. We see what's being said here by Mordecai as well as by Esther. So I want to look at just a couple things about this story, because I believe that, yes, you can take this principle and understand through God's sovereignty that we are here. We are where we are at. You are where you are at for such a time as this. Everything that we go through is for some purpose, for such a time as this. Now, we often want to think of Esther as being this person who was in this lavish lifestyle, and Mordecai had basically had to, let her know what her upbringing was, so to speak. But he understood this as well. This was not necessarily this life of luxury that Queen Esther had. She had literally lost all the people she knew to have to go into this, to have to be part of the kingdom. She had to lose all her friends. She was no longer really, she could communicate by sending her maids out and that sort of thing, but she really wasn't even allowed to go outside for a large extent. It was definitely a life of solitude. It was probably, no doubt, a sad life in some ways for her. But look at how God started preparing her. Now, obviously, no one would ever want to lose their parents at a young age, but as I was reading this, I was thinking, she was an orphan. Queen Esther, who was Esther as a child, had already been through this horrible hardship of losing her parents. So when it came time for her to be ushered off into the hall of the women for a year during the purification, she had already lost that attachment, so to speak. Obviously, she had the memories, but I think it was probably easier for her to go into that because she had lost that strong bond of her parents, because she wasn't able to have that. They had already been gone. We don't know how long they were gone, but I believe God started preparing her all the way back there through that. As she lost her parents, she would go into this, she would be virtually alone. It's basically like a year-long beauty pageant, so to speak, and I'm sure that there was probably sometimes that they would be some backbiting, some different things going on within all these women that were called in there, that were doing their purification together. But it says that the kings, the guy that was over the women there, said that he saw something in Esther. So we don't know exactly what that was. No doubt she was probably, maybe she was a peacemaker. Maybe she was somebody who tried to continue to help in that situation that they were in. But I believe God started preparing her all the way back when she was just a child because of that, for such a time as this, for the time that they were in, because Mordecai says, listen, there is no one in a greater position than you to help us, our people, in this situation. You're the queen. And no doubt maybe you were put in the kingdom for such a time as this. Now, maybe you are wherever you're at, what state you're in, because of someone who's there who needs you for such a time as this. Now, I believe in taking context, yes, and I know this is specifically talking to Queen Esther, but I believe also in the sovereignty of God, and we are where we are at for such a time as this. Now, if she failed to be the queen, she would still be kind of destined to spend her life there in the kingdom. She would be a concubine for the rest of her life. So she was literally giving up all of her life that she had known before because of this. I used to think as I read this through that, Mordecai kind of sent her off to go through this and she opted to do this, but I really don't see that in the scripture. Different people may say that, and honestly, I'm not sure, but as you just read this through, the book of Esther, starting in chapter 1, basically they went, and there's really no indication that she opted to do this. Probably they may have just selected certain people, and please, you can correct me if you want on YouTube, add to this story, but they took them away, and so she had to go through this. So Esther was prepared, and everybody who is possibly listening to this or wherever you are at, everyone has their own story to tell for such a time as this. Now, secondly, I'd like to bring up in this story that God is not mentioned. Two books, I believe, that in the Hebrew canon in the Old Testament, as we know it, where God is not mentioned. One of those is Song of Solomon. The name God is not mentioned, as I understand it, and also the book of Esther. Esther would be the only historical book where God is not mentioned by name. And I was thinking about that and how just our life today, we hear that God is not mentioned in so many things where he used to be in the public sector, where he would be mentioned at school or at wherever, at work even. We would hear and see that so much more often. In the political arena in the United States, we would hear God mentioned. He doesn't seem to be mentioned as much as he used to. But that doesn't mean that he is not at work. God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. And there was a lot of argument over whether it should be added to the canon of the scripture because of that. But we see God at work in and through the whole story of Esther. We see everything that he has led up to this, everything that he is pushing forward in this story, that God is at work in the book of Esther. He's always working behind the scenes. And even if you don't think of his name, even if you don't hear him, even if you don't see it, God is still working behind the scenes. And God is definitely working behind the scenes in the book of Esther. In this book, God is at work. He prepared Esther, God is working, and he's taking every step in the lives of these people. God is at work for such a time as this. Another thought I had as I was reading and studying this book through the week is influence who you are with. This story can be taken, and I'm not saying it doesn't mean this, but a lot of people have used the story to say, yes, see, we are to influence your political powers. And you know what? I'm not disagreeing with that. Esther, no doubt, was influencing the king of the time, and she was helping, and God put her there to do that. But note the rest of the Jews, even though Mordecai never tried to go to the king himself. Mordecai influenced the people that he was around. Mordecai influenced Esther. And Mordecai knew that Esther was in a position to influence the political power. So Mordecai didn't try to influence the political powers. Mordecai influenced Esther. And he started doing this before he ever knew there would be a problem. So right now, where you're at, influence the people that you are around. You never know what position they're going to be put in. You never know what need there is. And not only that, you know that they are someone who's created an image of God, and they need to be influenced. They need to be influenced for good. Mordecai influenced the people he was around. He started by taking her in when her parents had passed away, when Esther was but an orphan. Mordecai took her in and he began to influence her. He began to show her love, and he, no doubt, influenced her in ways that are unimaginable. And yet she was being prepared to be sent off in a life of solitude, so to speak, in the kingdom. All that was preparation for Esther for such a time as this. I heard somebody recently say that a preacher was saying that we don't go to work to make friends, you work to work. There's a part of me that understands what this person was saying, but this is what I want to say. We are put in our paths, our work, and honestly, there's a part of me that thinks all pastors should be somewhat bivocational, so they are influencing a group of people that aren't just at church. Because the people that are at church, a lot of times, at least now in 2021, if you go to church, people aren't going to go to church necessarily looking for something today. They're going to go online. They're going to look up a sermon online. A lot of times people that go to actual church, there's a connection already there. They want the fellowship. So in order to influence people who need exactly what we as Christians should have, we should influence them at work. We should influence them at the grocery store. Whatever the case may be, we should be an influence to them, to the good. I mean, consider this. We want, and I just last week we had the video on abortion. I'm against abortion. I think life starts at conception. I think it's something that we should stand on. Just like Mordecai, he may have not went to the political sector and said this, but when Haman come through and everybody was bowing, Mordecai knew what his stand would be. He knew that he would not bow to anyone other than God, and Mordecai would not bow. He refused to bow, yet he did not go to the king and say, I'm not bowing. He just showed it by his life. When it was necessary, Mordecai did it. And that's how he lived. That's what he did. But Mordecai, as he was influencing Queen Esther, through her life, we see this influence, and I kind of lost my train of thought, but I'm getting back to it. But this person said that you're not going to influence. You shouldn't necessarily worry about influencing people at work. But when we talk about abortion, that's where my mind was at, and we think about, let's go out and stand in front of the abortion clinic and try to help people. And I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong, but I'm going to tell you a better way to do it. Influence the people in your life. The person at work may be the one that is thinking of having an abortion. This is just an example. It's just an example. Maybe the person that you work with is going through trial in their marriage. And if you have been an influence on them, if you are a friend to them, they are more likely to come to you to say, what can I do to help my marriage? They are more likely to come to you and say, I'm struggling with this. I'm expecting. What do I do? And if you're going to influence people, be friends with them, love them, show them the love of God, and we do that for such a time as this. That is the number one way that we will ever help in those situations, without doubt. You may only influence one or two people, but that is exactly who God has put in your path. And if you're influencing one person to make a huge difference in something just like what we're talking about, then you have been such a success to influence that person because God put them in your life. And instead of worrying about, now listen, I want the culture to stay Christian, so to speak. I want our political powers to allow us to worship freely, to do these things. But if not, if God doesn't allow that, then we influence the people who we're with. We influence our neighbors, the ones we're around, so that the neighbor down the street, when they're having a problem, you don't have to, stand outside on the street and holler at them with a sign. No, they know you. They know that you love them already, and they want to talk to you about the problem, and you can influence them. Otherwise, they see you as someone who's hateful, someone who doesn't really care about them as a person. You care about your issue at hand. But if you care about the person, if you've been friends with them, if you have already been put in their path, that is the number one way that you can influence them. And this is what Mordecai did. He influenced those he was with. He saw the opportunity. He just knew it was natural. He took Esther in and he influenced her. And then when she became queen, he was able to influence her to influence the king. And we never know who we're in contact with, but influence the people that you are around. God has put them in your path for such a time as this. Now, I'd also like to point out that there was no guarantees. Now, here's what Queen Esther said. Okay, so she sends back word, and she says, I'll do this. And I'm paraphrasing. She said, but I want all the Jews to fast for 3 days. And this really kind of goes into the last point I was getting ahead, that there's some huge sacrifices that were made here. This is where we see God at work when they said, literally, I want you to fast for 3 days. They literally gave their whole 3 days to just praying and fasting to God, saying, we want this to work out. But this is what Esther said. Another huge phrase that is very well known in the scriptures. It says, she said, I want you to fast 3 days and night, and I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. She said, listen, I'm willing to do this, but there is no guarantees. I am willing, at this point, I'm willing to give my life. I'm willing to do this for such a time as this. And if I perish, I perish. She said, I don't know what will be the outcome, but I do know what is right. And we may not know the outcome, but we know what is right. We understand that there's something right, but we need to influence the people that we are around. Influence the people at your work. Influence the people at the store. It seems like maybe this is just me, but I feel like so often we think big, and if we're not thinking that we're influencing the whole culture, but you are influencing the culture by influencing the people that you are around. It can go back to the laws of multiplication, that we could go out and try to win as many people as we can to Christ, and you could win 8 million people a year. But in the long run, if you influence one person in that year and make them to where they will go out and influence one person per year, and so every year you're doubling. In 33 years, you have influenced 8 billion people. Correct me if I'm wrong, do the math, but if you just use the laws of multiplication, if you're just strongly influencing, being a friend to that one person for 1 year, and then it doubles every year, it's astronomical, the things that take place. Influence the people you're around. Understand that God has put you in the place where you are for such a time as this. You have every step you have gone through has been for a purpose. Every hardship, everything, just like Esther with losing her parents, with being taken away to the kingdom, it was all for such a time as this. And she said, if I perish, I perish. She was at a point where she was willing. Now, one of the things I had mentioned, that one of the phrases that does not change is those 6 words, but a phrase that does change quite often in that is where he says, deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And he says, well, who knows if you not come to the kingdom? Now, some places translate that a little different, but I love the phrase, the kingdom, because who knows if we are brought into the kingdom of God, the kingdom of, that Jesus Christ is coming to set up. We are brought into that kingdom for such a time as this. And no matter where you're at, what you're doing, what influences you've had in the past, God has taken you through each and every step of that for such a time as this.